Good morning. It is 11:38 a.m. on Sunday, October 15th, 2017. I'm Christiana Ellis and I just got up. This is 5 more minutes. It is Sunday, which means that it is time to continue the Avatar The Last Airbender rewatch with Season 3, Episode 20, Sozin's Comet Part 3, Into the Inferno. And it's the second to last episode of the whole series. And boy, things are totally ramping up. It's very exciting in this multi part finale to see this show. I mean, one of the things that makes this show great is how little. There's not really that much filler in it. Like, there's a handful of episodes here and there where the plot doesn't necessarily advance that much, but they focus it on trying to build character or whatever. And those episodes are definitely not wasted, but this has always been a show unafraid to change the status quo, especially once we got into season 2, where these kids are really moving through the world, leaving it changed behind them, and being changed by their own journey as well. But boy, as we ramp up for the finale, it's like, you can tell the gloves are off, all the cards are on the table, no holds barred, right? And so they're ramping up, and this is the big deal stuff here. And we don't get final resolution on any of the threads in this one, which is natural because, of course, we have one more episode to go, and that's where we're going to have the big finish of everything. But right now, everything is just ramping up and crazy and dire and in the thick of it. But the most compelling element of this episode to me, is actually not any of the fights, but rather it is a simple scene with Azula where we just see how thoroughly she's just falling apart. And it is the climax with this character that is part of what, I mean, if you've been watching these rewatches, you know that I'm definitely a big fan of Azula as a character in terms of her being a really interesting and compelling villain. She's certainly not a nice person, so it's not like liking her in that sense, but as a villain, she's very interesting and well presented, and this is kind of showing kind of where her personality type ultimately leads. Whenever she was striving against something, her talents allowed her to kind of continue to skate through, for the most part, never having to really deal with long-term ramifications of some of the stuff that she's doing. Being able to get by, as is discussed in this episode, by making people afraid of her. And it was just always her strategy, but we began this fall for her a few episodes back when Mai, because she loved Sokka, was willing to help him against Azula's wishes. Azula sees this as a betrayal, and Ty Lee turns against her in order to protect Mai, because the two of them, Mai and Ty Lee, had always had a sort of loyalty to Azula, but it was a little tenuous. I mean, we remember back when Ty Lee was first brought into this whole arrangement, like when we first see Azula recruit the two of them for her little team. We see that Mai seems like she was just kind of bored and willing to go along, but Ty Lee initially tried to say no and was basically extorted into agreeing by Azula, planning to ruin the circus that she worked for. So even with her closest friends, Azula still tried to rule through fear, and it worked for a while, until it didn't. And then when with her two friends turning against her, which she sees as this profound betrayal, that she doesn't have the emotional coping skills to really process, you combine that with giving her all the power she's ever felt like she wanted, but without any kind of a figure. Like, it's one thing when she's always been trying to make her father proud, but why? So that she could become the Fire Lord, right? Now he's given her that, and he's going off to be somewhere else, and he's basically told her the Fire Nation is yours to do with as you like. And with this sort of unfettered power granted her, and this still simmering feeling of betrayal that she's got running underneath her, plus her inability to deal with people through any means other than inspiring fear, we see now that it's all kind of starting to crumble, and it's kind of horrifying and fascinating to watch as she really starts to come apart here, and it's really interesting. So let's kind of step through some of what we see in this episode regarding Azula. And that is, the first time we see her, she is, we see her enjoying the pampering brought on by her rulership. All these servants giving her manicure, pedicure, doing her hair, feeding her cherries, and all of that. And it seems like she's just really going full in on, abuse of power and personal sense of power and everything. But to the point where she's starting to become unreasonable about it. And so when there's a pit in her cherry, which is an ordinary expected thing, and it's the sort of thing where it's like, did she tell anyone to take the pits out of her cherries before? Is this a made-up thing where she, is, going to demand that they should have known? We know, like, none of that matters, because we know that this is starting to be a manifestation of her honestly madness, right? She's got mental health problems. And so this idea of being even minorly inconvenienced by the tiniest, most trivial little thing, like a cherry pit, she has got it in her head that everything is supposed to be perfect now. But when even the tiniest thing isn't perfect, it just makes her brain start to process over to, well, what other things aren't perfect? Well, my friends betrayed me. And if they betrayed me and they were my closest friends, then who else might betray me? And so she, thrills in the abuse of power of this poor servant girl who didn't know any better. Demanding is like, well, I could have choked, this cherry pit, I'll show mercy. You are banished. And we then immediately see her turn on the rest of the servant girls, where she's established the dynamic here of like, you had better be doing everything you can to try to be perfect for me according to criteria that I will not announce ahead of time, or I will banish you, or worse. And so that's kind of terrifying right on the face of it. But then the next thing we see is the Dai Li, who followed her all the way from Ba Sing Se, who turned on their own previous master. Have come to report to her, and she, first of all, we can briefly just acknowledge that now that it's Azula, the flames in that Fire Lord chamber are blue, like her firebending, which is kind of cool. It's a cool look. I mean, it's in keeping, first of all, already with her using blue flames, so it makes sense, but also just in conveying that things are different now. This is different. And she complains that the Dai Li took 5 minutes to get there, and insisting, oh, someone could have assassinated me in the meantime. But it's clear, first of all, that she doesn't really feel she doesn't really fear being assassinated, right? I mean, she doesn't seem to be really worried about that at all. Certainly not from like some sort of an outsider. This is down to, once again, she is becoming convinced and paranoid that everyone is plotting against her, which in some cases, as she gets worse and worse, is probably increasing the likelihood of that. And she's probably, there's a part of her aware of that too. But she doesn't have any other tools in her toolbox, right? So she insists that they're all banished, and they insist, but we're so loyal to you, we've done all this. And she's like, yeah, you probably told that to Long Fang, your previous leader, before you betrayed him to serve me. And they don't really have a good reply to that. Once she banishes them, she tells them to send in the next group, right? And we can also start to see then when Lo and Lee, those two old ladies that we were introduced to them alongside with Azula, as clearly people that she's previously been willing to listen to, and at least to some extent. But they come to her and they're saying, you've banished all your servants and the Daily and the Imperial Firebenders. This is starting, you don't have anyone else to banish. And it starts, it's more and more clear to everyone around her that she's not just temperamental. This is not just new. This is crazy. She is not behaving rationally, and she has set up this impossible standard where anyone who's going to serve her must be perfect, but her own paranoia is going to find any possible way in which someone could be imperfect and use that to eliminate them, leaving her completely isolated. It's this complicated mess of fear of abandonment and betrayal, where she's becoming kind of a social underachiever. She's pushing everybody away before they can reject her. And even Lo and Lee, they're trying to be very gentle and just kind of say, well, this is starting to be a little weird. And we're also seeing that she, Azula looks very disheveled, with her hair and clothing compared to usual, because of course she has fired all of her servants and she doesn't have anyone to help her take care of those things, and she's not good at doing it by herself because she's never had to. And so it's, and she's also, there's probably an element like where she maybe could do it more herself, but her agitation is continuing to get worse and worse. But as soon as these old ladies bring up the topic of possibly postponing the coronation, oh, nope, now they have to go too. And she at first demands that they fight in Agni Kai, and they have to remind her that they're not actually firebenders. So she's hardly even seeing the people in front of her at this point. And then she decides one of them will be banished and not the other, but she doesn't know she points to Lo and says, Lee, you're banished. Or no, I think she points to Lee and says, Lo, you're banished. Lee, you can stay. But because she pointed to the wrong one, she walks out of the room, and the two old ladies are like, well, which one of us is banished? Although with those two, you can totally imagine that, they're not going anywhere separated. But it's all kind of, no one knows quite what to do, because Azula is practically self-imploding the command structure of the Fire Nation, which is in many real respects kind of the exact opposite of what her responsibilities are. But she is incapable of doing any better, and so then we see her trying to do her own hair and getting so frustrated with her inability to do it properly that she goes to cut off her bangs and makes it look even worse. according to the Avatar Wikia, her long and disheveled hair is evocative of a classic Japanese villainess in named Oiwa, who was a woman scorned, and who was murdered, and so she turned back into a vengeful spirit. But I guess the look is kind of evocative of that. But it's also very good, especially once she cuts it, at just conveying how unhinged she is now. And we see her trying to do it, and then she imagines that she sees her mother in the mirror. And it's kind of neat how, at least at first, we, the viewer, are not completely sure. It seems. I think I never really believed that her mother was actually there, partly just because she looks just like we last saw her, so there's no like change in the aged element. But I think there's also this sort of just instinctive feeling like she's probably dead. And so and given that we've got so many signs already of Azula coming unglued, that it seems plausible that she would hallucinate at this point. And to have, this, her mother is kind of the archetypal betrayal in Azula's mind, because although it's not the source of her various issues necessarily, it was one of the first times that she felt that someone who was supposed to love her unconditionally thought she was a monster and seems to prefer Zuko. And that was kind of a first step down a road, an emotional journey for Azula, where this sense that she has to try to control people through fear, because she believes that she doesn't have anything else, that nothing else will work. She's forced to try to control people through fear, because otherwise they'll just leave her unless they're afraid to do so. And so this idea, this vision of her mother trying to tell her that that's to try to point out, look at everything that's going wrong for you right now, you're confused. And the Ursa, the mother, tries to say, no, I love you. And even though Azula kind of would have wanted to hear it, she can't let herself believe it. She throws her brush, shatters the mirror, and it's revealed definitively that she had imagined her mother being there, but she's just descending into sobs. And we've never seen Azula this low. And yet it feels so very plausible as a direction for her character based on everything that has come before, even though part of what was interesting about her through much of the series was just how hyper competent she was and how dangerous she was. But now we see what's happening when that person has allowed their insecurities, their fears about being betrayed, to begin to take over and rule their mind, and they've driven everyone away, and she doesn't have anyone to balance those impulses now, and she's just completely self-destructing. And it's so terrifying and yet compelling to watch. She's such an interesting character, but at the same time, as we get towards the end of this episode, we have this realization that, just because she's coming unglued in this way does not mean that she is not still very dangerous. And in some respects, Zuko kind of makes that mistake, because as we see, with what limited people Azula has allowed to remain near her, about to do the coronation, that is when we have Katara and Zuko arrive on Appa. And Zuko confronts Azula and sees how unstable she looks, senses that she's slipping, and makes this decision to challenge her to Agni Kai instead. And this idea that, that way I think I can take her now, and if that's true, then nobody else needs to get hurt. And we can see Katara, willing to let that begin, but at the same time we can sort of see in her eyes going like, really? Is that what we're doing right now? Is that because that doesn't seem quite right, but okay. And so we see this really impressive Agni Kai, this long-awaited rematch between Azula and Zuko, and they're both enhanced. They've got super-powered firebending from the Comet, and it's just super intense. We can see that their fire blasts, they're barely evading each other's attacks. They're setting fire to the nearby buildings. It's this huge, huge thing, and but Zuko is better than he had before, and to some extent, Azula had been slipping somewhat, and so eventually she falls, and he taunts her, saying, how come you haven't tried to send lightning at me? Is it because I'll redirect it? And it's kind of a position of, is he baiting her? But what happens next he had not predicted, because this is the element where he saw that she was slipping and yet still tried to approach it as though she was gonna play fair, which first of all she never did in the first place, but now in her unstable state she's going to do anything. And so even though Katara is outside the bounds of this Agni Kai, like the whole idea of the Agni Kai was this assumption that both parties are going to follow the rules. And so instead, because she knows that it will mess things up, she, instead of shooting her lightning at Zuko, who is prepared to redirect it, he sends it at Katara. Zuko senses this at the last second and manages to intercept the lightning. But we can see, and we're reminded back of when Iroh first taught him to redirect lightning, that you have to keep it away from your heart, and he fails to do so as he intercepts this lightning. And we don't, it's near the end of the episode, so we don't have a definitive read on just how hurt he is, but it seems pretty bad. He is certainly temporarily out of commission, at least. And so then, the state we end the episode is that Azula, perhaps a little bit tired and certainly unbalanced, but still superpowered by Sozin's Comet, is coming at Katara, who is now on her own. Terrifying, to say the least. And again, it's like this part of the story with Azula is a big part of what makes her character so fascinating in a rewatch, is just having been able to watch the journey to this point. But also, to be now thinking of it from Katara's perspective of how much she's grown, the confidence that she has earned in her own abilities and how good she is, but now being put to a very serious test of being forced now to duel solo with an extremely dangerous individual, where it's not at all clear that she is up to the task. I mean, the whole idea was that she and Zuko were supposed to do it together because Azula is that dangerous. But yeah, we'll have to see in the next episode. So in the meantime, we remember back at the beginning of this episode where we had Zuko and Katara observing the comet as they made their way, and Katara kind of commenting on how it's actually kind of pretty, and it's an interesting duality of knowing how dangerous it is in the things that it represents, and yet being able to observe the aesthetic qualities to it. And it's the sort of thoughtful observation that we expect out of Katara. But Zuko reiterates at the beginning of this episode one of the primary concerns that has covered the last few episodes and is continuing to drive this idea of what is going to happen when Aang fights Ozai. Because they never resolved the idea of, can Aang bring himself to kill a person, even someone as dangerous as Ozai? And he's worried because he doesn't know. So there's a little bit of reestablishing at the beginning of this episode where Zuko and Katara are and what they're doing, but also reminding us of that central conflict. And so then, we don't really have any more with Katara and Zuko until they show up at Azula, which we've already dealt with. But so let's talk a little bit about Sokka and Suki and Toph having gone to try to deal with the fleet of airships. We see them arrive just as the fleet is starting to take off, so they're forced to, without a plan, launch themselves up just to get onto one of the last airships. They're gonna, it's like, uh-oh, the attack is in progress. We're gonna have to figure out how to do something right away. And here's where we see some really impressive stuff. A lot more really great combat and action in this series of episodes, with just some incredibly creative and interesting uses of bending that still reads properly, like we can intuitively understand what's happening when we see it. It's not confusing. It's great. And in fact, actually, the trivia in the Wikia for this episode suggests that this episode won an Annie Award for directing in a animated episode. But so we have them rush the the bridge of this airship, and a really fun sequence where Toph just kind of knock, kaboom, knocks down the door, jumps onto it, wraps herself in a metal suit. This is a degree of metal bending we have not seen her use before, but we can assume she's been practicing. But in any case, protected by this metal armor, she is able to, be protected from the firebending of the crew here, and then she takes a few minutes and just wham, 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 takes out the entire bridge crew. And so now we've got Katara and Suki Suki and Sokka and Toph, having taken control of one, but knowing there's a whole bunch more crew and 16 more airships. So yeah, still a lot to deal with. Actually, I think 16 more. I think that's right. In any event, so there's a little bit of fun stuff that is part of what's great about this series, is the ability to throw these little silly things in the mix with everything else. So, like, how do we get rid of the rest of the crew? Well, Sokka gets on the radio and, "Hey everybody, report to the Bombay for hot dates and sweet cream. It's a very special birthday." And then on top of that, we already kind of suspect what's going on. But to get the little bit of these crew members who don't normally ever get to talk to each other, because the sort of gathering doesn't usually happen, kind of like, "Oh, hey, yeah, you work in communications, I work in the engine room, so I guess that's why I never met each other." It's like, whose birthday is it? And there is one guy who it is actually his birthday, and he's so happy. And then it's also just a nice touch that the kids do fly low enough that these guards are not going to be hurt as they are dropped out the Bombay doors, into the water. And then the last little grace note of that sequence of these people in the water. It's like, happy birthday. Good stuff. But so now, having seized total control of this one airship, they're flying ahead. They get a glimpse of, first of all, we got a glimpse earlier on to show us that this destination of where the fleet is heading, we recognize the landscape of, that is where the lion turtle dropped Aang off last time. So it seems like this confrontation is, kind of preordained by fate and everything. But they're trying to catch up. they get to see the opening salvos of just how powerful the firebending can be with the Comet present, and it's fairly terrifying. It is truly a weapon of mass destruction now, and they're just, burning all, whole forests in a matter of seconds as they make their way towards civilization. And they're trying to catch up. Sokka and the others manage to get a glimpse of Aang and are overjoyed that he is, back, and that's going to happen. He's going to take on Ozai, but they have to keep on with their part of the plan, which is to take out the fleet. And so when Toph calls him Captain Boomerang, he gets the idea that they're going to try to essentially use the hard bits of their own airship to kind of cut through the balloon parts of all of the others. And, to some extent, the engineer in me wants to say that there's some dubious stuff happening during this whole sequence in terms of, would you really be able to just sail through the whole line of them that way? And, the turn that they make is kind of an aggressive turn. And but you know what? I mean, in terms of storytelling, what makes that sequence work even past some, willingness to suspend disbelief, is that it is presented as having a cost. Like, the airship they're on is not just fine as a result of this, it's falling apart even as they do it. They have to run up to the top, they're having to try to stay ahead of this thing falling apart, and in fact we see Suki get separated from Toph and Sokka, and we don't get resolution of that. So we see that they've been largely successful, at the very least, of taking out all of these airships, but are they okay? Unclear. They don't seem to really have a plan, but they did what they needed to do, and so the airship fleet seems like it's perhaps at least incapacitated, but they are not out of danger, and we don't know how that's going to play out yet. Meanwhile, we have the old masters, the Order of the White Lotus that we met last time, attempting to take back Ba Sing Se, and we get a nice moment with Iroh where he he takes a moment to deep breathe. He's feeling the effects of the comet. And then, we saw in Season 2 just what was required to deal with the huge walls of Ba Sing Se. And then Iroh, powered by the comet, just able to blow a fireball right through it. And so we see some really epic bending combat with these masters going in and essentially attempting to retake an entire city, more or less just the 5 of them. It's pretty intense, and there's some great action there. And so last but not least, we have Aang and Ozai. And in this episode is where, even in the rewatch, I feel kind of dumb for not having realized sooner that Mark Hamill is the voice of Ozai. I guess I just never really kind of caught it before, but now, with all of this power, Ozai is getting a little bit more unhinged on his own. This idea that he is on the verge of getting everything that he wanted, and so I think I hear Mark Hamill's voice a little bit more in this episode, and it's great. But it just is also just like, well, why didn't I remember that from before? But oh well. But, of course, as we have this confrontation begin, we were reminded at the beginning of this episode that Aang really still doesn't have a plan. He's going to have to fight Ozai, that much is obvious. But he has not resolved himself to being prepared to kill him, and he has no other plan, which means that he is already failing to have taken the advice of his previous Avatar selves. And it's a bad situation to be in, and we see that play out in this fight. First, we see the confrontation where Ozai, first of all, is amused by the idea of generations of firebenders have tried to find you, and yet now here you just show up just for me, an act of providence. And he's just really bemused by that. Aang tries to tell him, you have the power to make all of this stop. But again, it's like, as well-meaning as that might be, Aang, you know he doesn't want to stop. I suppose it's important to make sure that the option was presented, except that it's a little disingenuous because it's really only Aang that doesn't want to fight. Um, so the fighting begins. We get this really cool landscape with all of these rock spires. Some of them are actually a little bit resembling, some landscape we see with. Well, yeah, never mind that. But just this intense landscape with all of these different spires that they're leaping between. Aang with his airbending and Ozai with using his firebending for like jetpack-like action, and they're just going at each other, and they seemingly very evenly matched. Aang using firebending a lot more than he has previously, probably because it's super powered right now. But Aang is kind of hesitant to really even try to attack. So they're evenly matched when Ozai is going all out for offense and Aang is going all out for defense, which can't go on forever. But it's all they can do right now until finally, when Ozai gets frustrated, he brings out the lightning, and Aang, at first doesn't want to try to redirect the lightning because he's still afraid of that power. And so he tries to evade it, he tries to evade it, he tries to evade it until he can't evade it anymore. He does intercept it, and he's at the point where he now could redirect it. He could send it back at Ozai and try to kill him, and he can't bring himself to do it. So he shoots the lightning off into the sky, and it's interesting, the dilemma that this show has put us in the sense that rationally, it's very hard to feel that the others are wrong when they tell him, no, you're going to have to kill him. But the show still has nonetheless made us empathize with Aang in this feeling of, it feels like there has to be another way. But we don't know what that's going to be. So now, having failed to take the shot when he had it, Aang is once again in full defense mode, and he is forced to retreat into just a tiny little shell of rock as Ozai tells him to prepare to die. And that's where we finish the episode. Only one more half hour to go as we see Sozin's Comet Part 4, Avatar Aang, the series finale. So I'll be back next week to talk about that episode. And I'll talk to you tomorrow for 5 more minutes.